Good evening. On behalf of Ted and Mary Stahl and the Stahl Automotive Foundation, I'm Jeff Stumb, the Executive Director of Stahls Motors Music Experience, and I want to welcome you to the first of our new series of speakers and guests called Fuel for Thought. I really appreciate you being here on such a exciting night. We had over 200 people pre-register for this event. So thank you very much. That sped up the process of everybody coming in. And what a way to kick this series off, but with the Chrysler Turbine Car. I know that's so special to everybody in this area. But I did want to point out a few things before we get started. We have special T-shirts for sale that have been designed just for this event that have the Chrysler Turbine Car on the back. Really 1960s mod colors. There's 4 different colors of shirts and all different sizes. You can buy those shirts in the gift shop as you leave tonight. The T-shirts are $25, and then there's some long sleeves that are $30. Please remember that Stahls Automotive Foundation is a 501c3, and we do accept donations. There's a donation box as you leave as well. There's a donation box around throughout the collection, and we appreciate that. It helps keep the lights on. You notice the lights just went off here because we didn't have enough money. I also want to point out that there's more than 200 people in here tonight for this event. If you have a corporate event and you're looking for a unique place or just a family event, you can have that here. We do rent the facility out for a lot of events. You could do as small as something in our Big Boy restaurant or something as large as this. We've had corporations just in the last couple of months, 150 strong doing events here, including sit-down meals. So reach out to us at stahlsauto.com. You can get all the information there that you might need. I did want to also point out, if you did not know, that we are in the midst of an expansion. We're going to increase the size of this facility by an additional 70,000 square feet. What you may not know is that there are 3 other buildings this size around the area that house just as many cars as that are in here. And some really amazing special cars that we're going to start rotating through the museum here. But when we have that event facility completed, we hope to break ground very, very soon. We'll be able to host events up to 500 people at one time. And when you walk in the front door, the first thing you'll see is a real carousel. So it's going to be an amazing facility. You may have read some things about it on the internet or in the newspaper, but that will be, you'll start to see some, as soon as we get a break in the weather, you're going to start seeing some work done on the 17 acres just behind this building, behind this parking lot over here, and behind this building. We are doing the Fuel for Thought, which is what we're calling this event. This is the first one. We're doing it quarterly in 2026. This is the winter event. There'll be a spring, a summer, and a fall. And I can tell you that the next one will be in May, and it will be on mascots. And I look around and I can see these are hardcore car guys in here, and you know what mascots are. And so we've got an expert coming in. I'm actually looking very much forward to that because I love all the mascots, especially from the teens, the 20s, and the 30s. So that'll be coming up in May. You want to go ahead and pre-register for that. We already have people. It's open now, and you can start pre-registering for that. So, all right, now we got that housekeeping taken care of. I know what you're really here for. and that's to hear this car. And then we will be starting the car at the end of tonight's presentation. And I would ask that when we do that, you please keep your seats. And after we do that, I'll turn it off after a short time. We will do it. We will start it again later and let you come up to the car. Okay. So when we do it right at the end, just please keep your seats. So it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Lehto. He's written a book on the Chrysler Turbine Car, has a YouTube channel as well. And I'm going to tell you, he is one of the foremost experts on turbine cars. So please welcome Steve Lehto. Yes, yes.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me in the back. I love speaking in the Detroit area because whenever I speak here, people come up to me before and after the talk and say, I worked on that car. My dad worked on that car. I know somebody who had one of those cars. I remember seeing those cars in traffic, and I get that more here than any place else. And so before my talk, it was fascinating meeting so many people. So I have to warn you because there's people in the audience who actually know just as much about this car as I do. But I'm going to try to speak to everybody here. And this, of course, is a Chrysler Turbine Car. And I want to make sure this is very clear because some people might wonder, why would you want to put a turbine engine in a car? So many different ways you can power a car with a gasoline engine, with pistons, or an electric motor. Those were popular at one time also. They're coming back, I hear. But a turbine engine has fewer moving parts than a reciprocating engine. And they also can burn a variety of fuels, which we'll talk about. And so there are many advantages that could be seen with a turbine engine in an automobile. So right after World War II, people were trying to develop turbine technology for a variety of purposes. And people at Chrysler said, you know, we think we can shoehorn one of those into a car. So I'd like to point out here, this is a photograph of them lowering a turbine engine into a car for the first time, a serial mono photograph. On the far right is a gentleman right about there who is George Hubner. Many people who work in this program or know about the program know George Hubner was the guy who was the cheerleader. He was the genius. He was the general. He was the guy leading the program. He was there from the beginning to the end. And without him, the program probably would not have gotten half as far as it did. Also right there is a man named Dr. Sam Williams. Sam Williams was probably the technical genius behind, we think we can take that jet engine, the turbine engine, and shrink it down, stick it in the engine compartment of a car and make it work. Of course, a lot of other people in the photograph here doing research on my book. And by the way, the book is coming out in a new edition. That's one of the reasons I'm talking about this so much now is this is actually a new edition of the book. The first book came out, I think, 08 or 09, and I updated it recently. But in researching this book, I interviewed as many of those people as I could find in the early 2000s. And sadly, we've lost a few of them. And every time we do, we lose a little bit more of the knowledge that they had because some of these guys knew so much stuff about this, and it's not stuff you can learn from books, despite the fact I write books. So just trust me on that one. So that's the car being put together, the photograph, and then, of course, they roll it out to the press. All the people on the left are journalists, and people in the car are from Chrysler. Believe it or not, Sam Williams is in the back seat of that photograph. And you got to look at it real closely. I don't know if you can see it on this one, but he is actually sitting in the back seat. Dr. Williams was heavily involved at the beginning of the program. And then he later went off and formed his own company called Williams Research that developed into Williams International. Williams International is still around. It's being run by Sam's son, Greg. But here they are rolling it out to the press. And one of the things they discovered about this car, when you hear this thing run, you'll understand. They sound different than any other car you've ever heard before. They sound like a low-flying jet. And every time they wheeled one out, people were amazed. And notice the guy on the left who's appearing to be shooting some film, but there's photographs. And they very quickly realized the interest in this car was huge. And in fact, they did very little advertising of the program. They almost did nothing but accept the free publicity they got by the news people climbing over each other to get looks at the car, to drive the car, to ride in the car. And you can go back and look through newspaper archives from the 50s and 60s. Chrysler Turbine Car, it's all over the news. And they were always talking about this. But of course, they've got to make the thing practical. They got to make it to where somebody can actually buy one and use it, and also make it competitive with other cars at the time that had piston engines. So this is the early 50s, 53, 54-ish. And they put the engines into a bunch of different cars. And along the way, we think they probably built 77 maybe of all the cars from beginning to end of the program that had turbine engines in them. This car is often called the turbine car. And this car actually has only one nameplate on it. And that is, it says turbine. It's more than one plate, but that's the name of it. The car is simply called the turbine. But like this says turbine special on it. And it's got a turbine engine in it. Of course, that's George Huebner, I think, talking to the president of Chrysler. And they would work on an engine, improve it a little bit, put it in the car, drive it around, troubleshoot it, and decide what they needed to do with it. And they would eventually come up with a next generation engine. So they had a first generation, second generation, third generation, and they would improve the engine a little bit each time. There are some disadvantages to turbine engines being in cars. For instance, a gas engine, you stomp on the gas, it accelerates immediately. A jet turbine engine, you stomp on the gas, and there's a little bit of turbo lag in there, like you get off a turbocharger. So there's one of the things that they would try to work on. But knowing how much free publicity they got every time they brought one outside, George Huebner decided to drive one cross country. In fact, he did this twice. And him and a bunch of other guys from Chrysler jumped in a car in New York City, held a big old press conference, all kinds of journalists there. And then they drove it across country, stopping at Chrysler dealers and other places along the way. Headlines everywhere they went. And in fact, this story here, I believe, is from Popular Mechanics. And it's them driving this car cross country to prove how durable these cars are. And in fact, these cars do really, really well when they're holding a steady state speed, kind of like a jetliner up at cruising altitude. Stop and go traffic's not where they shine, but driving cross country coast to coast, a first in automotive history. We drove a turbine car coast to coast, and George Huebner was in the car. George Huebner, by the way, personally loved publicity. The guy was a publicity hound. I've only found one photograph of him where he's not wearing a jacket and a tie. And I spoke a couple years ago in Grand Rapids to a group of strangers, and I was talking about George Huebner and what a publicity hound he was. And a woman came up and she goes, "George Huebner was my father." And I said, "Okay." And she goes, "And you nailed him." So you will find pictures of George Huebner hanging out the window of the car to make sure his face is in the picture but not being distorted by the windshield. So George Huebner understood PR. And of course, we want to get Chrysler to build these things and sell these things. We get all the publicity we can get. So here's another turbine special driving along, and it does say turbine special on the side. You can't really see it on this screen, but you'll notice there's a big mouth exhaust on that rear bumper there. And from the outside, there's very little different about these cars, and Chrysler did that on purpose. They didn't want turbine cars to be weird. They wanted them to just be an alternative. But turbines do chew up a lot of air, and it goes through and it comes out the other end. So you got to have big exhausts and big air intakes. So that's one. Now, weirdly, there are always these stories that follow any new technology, wives' tales and so on. And there was always the story that you didn't want to go anywhere near a turbine car. It would burn you to death. It might melt the pavement, might melt the car behind it. It would certainly singe the skin off your hands. And so George Huebner is holding a handkerchief by the tailpipe there to show you that it's perfectly safe and it will not burn your stockings or kill your cat or anything like that. And that story about the exhaust being dangerously hot is one of those stories that's dogged this program since day one. When the Stahl Museum first took delivery of this car, I was here the day they fired it up, and I shot a video of myself with my hand in the exhaust just to show that I was going to have my hand. But it's one of those things that he was trying to dispel right there. You notice across top, the trunk, it does say turbine special. So here's an aerial view of another turbine engine that's been shoehorned into a car. I like this image because, among other things, you can see those big beer kegs in the front. Those are air intakes. And they discovered that by pointing the air intakes at each other like that, it would kind of cancel out the sound. Interestingly, jet engines make a lot of noise. You know that if you've been to an airport. However, a lot of the noise that you think of coming from a jet engine is coming off the front of the jet engine, where the air comes in, and some noise coming off the back. And so they did that to quiet down the intakes. But interestingly, later, when they interviewed people who had driven these cars and asked them what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, some people actually said it wasn't loud enough because people wanted it to sound like a jet. But trust me, I've driven 3 of these surviving cars, including this one, and they're loud just fine. People's heads snap around as they hear it coming. And I've driven Jay Leno's through the streets of Burbank, and you got to see pedestrians snap their heads around because they think they're about to get hit by an airplane. So they experimented with turbines in all kinds of stuff. They put one in a truck. This is one, you don't see a lot of photographs of this. That's one of the reasons I included it in my presentation. But I believe the photograph was taken at an auto show in Chicago. And I heard that they drove the vehicle there as part of the publicity of it. And then, of course, they showed it off. So, yeah, we drove it here, and they drove it back. Not sure what happened to it. Chrysler might still have it. I don't know. But like I said, we think there's probably about 77 cars or vehicles they put turbine engines into. So when they got the 4th generation turbine engine, they thought they'd gotten an engine that was efficient enough and bulletproof enough to lend to the average person. So remember, if you're going to make cars in America, you've got to have a car that you can toss the keys to any person and say, here, drive this car. And so think about how low the common denominator is. I like to tell people that so any average American idiot can drive it. They said, okay, the 4th generation engine is bulletproof enough to do that. So they decided to build a fleet of cars as a publicity stunt and lend them to the public. Remember, George Huebner loves publicity, doesn't spend money on advertising, but he talked Chrysler into building a fleet of these cars right here. So this car was handmade in Italy by Ghia. You've heard of Ghia before. They make a lot of bodies for the automotive industry in Europe and also higher-end stuff in America. And you might recognize the shape as being reminiscent of a T-bird. Elwood Engel, who worked at Ford, who designed one of the T-birds there, came to Chrysler, and this is one of the first jobs he worked on. And I still say that the bumper on this car is the greatest-looking bumper in any automobile ever made. And I will die on that hill. But they built 55 of these cars, and the plan was to lend 50 of them. They lent 46 or 48 of them out. You could send a postcard to Chrysler and say, I want to drive a turbine car. And they would go through the applications they got. And if they chose you, and they would interview you, find out, what type of car do you have now? Where do you drive the car? What kind of, place are you going to be driving it to? Where do you live? They tried to scatter it around the country. And they lent these cars to 203 different families around America. You would get the car, and you could drive the car for a few months. All you had to do was put fuel in it. No insurance, no maintenance. And in fact, they told you specifically if anything went wrong with it, you call us, we'll send a guy out to you. And Bill Carey, who's the guy on the cover of my book, that was his job. He was the guy flying around the country. He told me he'd get a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning that one of your engines just blew up in Dallas. And he told me, he said, I jump on the phone, make reservations, call Chrysler, tell them to ship an engine to Dallas. I'd be on the plane trying to meet the engine. Boom. And they're trying to keep the downtime to a minimum on these vehicles. And they did a pretty good job of it. In fact, those cars logged about 1 million miles, relatively trouble-free. And the experiment was considered to be a very, very successful one. And so it's a really cool car. I'll point some other things out about it. Here's a schematic I've always enjoyed. It only has one mistake, and this is just because there's a schematic drawn quite early, but the schematic does show that there is a battery right there. Actually, the car's got 2 batteries in the trunk, no battery up front. It's a 12-volt system, but it has a 24-volt starter because to start a turbine engine, you got to spin it up pretty fast, and it didn't quite have the juice to do that with one battery. But other than that, you'll notice that the gigantic air cleaner in the front, because of how much air it's taking in. You notice the size of the exhaust pipes going out the back. They're not round. They're like that, ovalized. They're quite large. And that's because so much air is traveling through there coming out of the engine. And so they built 55 of these, but like I said, they were all built in Italy, then shipped over here in crates, but they didn't have engines and transmissions in them yet. That was done at a plant on Greenfield Road. The building is still there. It's gone through a bunch of different evolutions. At one point in time, it was a popcorn factory. But I actually interviewed one of the guys in this picture, and it's actually in the third car back. There's a guy leaning over the front fender. I actually spoke to him about this. And when the cars came, they were crated and they were fully assembled, but they didn't have the electronics in them. So they had to actually take a lot of the interior out and then wire the car, put the stuff back in, and put the drivetrain in. And they were basically building these cars one at a time at that facility. And I heard some great stories about that. But they were unpacking them and then building them and then shipping off to consumers. And every time they delivered one to a consumer, there'd be a huge gathering of the press around them as they delivered the car. Now, the 55 cars, 54 of them were this color. There was one that was white. And if you're familiar with the movie The Lively Set, it's a really bad movie with a really cool car in it. And during the opening credits, it says starring so-and-so and the Chrysler Turbine Car, like it's a person. And it's actually the most interesting character in the movie. But that car is being driven in the movie, and there's a guy named George Stetcher who's driving it on screen. And George's son is in the audience here somewhere. I was talking to him a few minutes ago. And it's fascinating because Chrysler was approached, would you like to put this car in a movie? And, of course, George Huebner's like, yes. And they said, but the only caveat is no one can drive this car because they don't know what California people are going to do to the car. So George Stetcher went out and babysat the car on the set. And the white car is in the movie. It's got a stripe. I think it might have a number on it at one point. Here, I believe it's at a training facility. And they're probably talking about how easy it is to drop the engine out of this car because you drop it out from the bottom, not pulling it out through the top. There's a whole thing about how the front end goes together with the cradle and all that. But I'm not sure if I know anybody in that picture by name, but that's one of the rare photographs of the white car. The white car was out there, but it was one of the cars that was, not lent to the public. The ones lent to the public were identical to this one. And it's interesting they did that. If you think about it, they put these engines in a 1964 Dart or something. It would not have had the same impact. People say, I heard the car. But when you see the car and you hear the car and it's totally radical and different, new and unique, it does make a bigger impact on you. So some of the other cars, for instance, though, there were two of them at the New York World's Fair. And they actually built a track. And there was a track where you could go in, and they actually handed out tickets to the ride, like it was a ride at the fair. And you could go there, stand in line, and get a ticket. You could actually give the person your ticket, get in the car. They drove it, but they'd drive around the loop, and then you got out. And there were people standing in line for hours to get a ride in the Chrysler Turbine Car. They kept two cars there in case one broke down. They didn't want to have anybody ever say, oh, I was going to get a ride in the Turbine Car, but it broke down. No. That never happened. That did not happen. And so I've spoken to people who were there, including Jay Leno. Jay Leno, at the age of, I think, 14, said he was at the New York World's Fair, and it was famous for two cars, the Turbine Car and the Mustang. And he said he went and looked at the Mustang and said, look at the Turbine Car. And he said he sat there with his arm on the fence, just watching it go around in circles. And his dad comes by and goes, dude, come on, let's go. I'm watching a Turbine Car. And of course, today Jay's got a Turbine Car, but we'll get there. So when they deliver the cars, it's a big publicity stunt. You can find articles, the Royal Oak Tribune, it's one of my favorite articles, headline front page, local banker gets Turbine Car. It's hard to imagine that making the headlines today, but it passed for news back then. But that's Bill Carey pointing at something inside the car to a nice young couple who's getting the car lent to them. And he's basically explaining to them about how you do not step on the gas before you start the engine. Many people getting in a car built in 1964 would put the key in, hit the gas twice to set the choke, then hit the starter. And of course, you'd flood this thing, you put too much fuel in the burner. So they actually had a circuit in there that was designed to shut the engine off if you did that. And the only way to turn the engine back on was to pop the hood, pop that black circuit box cover off, flip a switch, put the cover back down, put the hood back down, go back inside and do it again. It was designed to teach you not to do it again. So Bill Carey's explaining that. Nice young couple is going to get the car for a couple months. And I've spoken to people who said, you know, Steve, I saw one of these cars in New Hampshire in 1965. And I say, oh, I can probably tell you who had the car. Because you can go online now at turbinecar.com, and there's a guy, Mark Olson, who just recently passed away, who put up the list that Chrysler had of all the users who had the car, where they had the car, when they got the car, and you can look this stuff up and find out, oh, that's car 37. And after it went from there, it went to over here. It's amazing how well they documented this. But again, free publicity for the program. So here's the problem. Chrysler built 55 of these cars. The program went really, really well. People loved the cars, but they couldn't sell these cars to the public, and they knew that going in. And Chrysler and most of the big car companies don't like their prototype cars getting out to the public. Now, this isn't a prototype car, but it's a limited edition car. And so they had made the decision before they even shipped them into America to put a temporary import duty that they would pay on it. You have a choice. You can pay a temporary import duty, you bring it in, and shortly thereafter you ship it back out, or you destroy it. On the other hand, let's suppose you're a Formula One racer and you bring your car to America. You're going to race it here and then take it back out again. Temporary import. So they decided to pay the temporary import duties on 46 of them and pay the permanent import duties on 9 of them. The other 46 had to be destroyed. And this is one of those things, and I've spoken to people who were there. I've also spoken to people whose parents were there, and they took them to a wrecking yard out by Romulus near the airport. You'll notice the engines are not in them because the engines and transmissions were built here in America. It's the body that was built in Italy and imported. They had to take the cars, smash them, crush them, and burn them. And that's what they did with 46 of the cars. 9 of the cars survived. This is one of them. Chrysler has 2 of them. Jay Leno's got one. The Smithsonian's got one. St. Louis has got one. The Henry Ford Museum's got one. There's one at the Gilmore. There's one here. I think I got them all. But there's 9 of them that still exist. So the question is, what are you going to do now? We have the 4th generation engine. It appears to be as close to bulletproof as you can make a jet engine. And people love the idea of the program. They started asking around inside Chrysler, what would it cost to mass produce a turbine car? And they got some very disturbing numbers back. And I actually interviewed one of the guys who was in charge of figuring out whether it was mathematically possible. And they said, well, here's the problem. These engines were all built basically by hand. They only built 60 or 70 engines. And building engines like that's very expensive. If you want to build engines cheaply, you've got to mass produce them, and they'd have to build a factory from the ground up. Somebody said, what would it cost to build a factory from the ground up to build turbine engines? Somebody said $1 billion with a B. They said, well, that's not going to work. They said, how much would it cost us to continue doing what we're doing now, but maybe just up the production a little bit? And I talked to one guy who said that it was probably be more than $10,000 per engine. At the exact same time, you could pull a 318 V8 off the shelf for about $300. So is someone going to spend a bump of $10,000 to put a turbine engine in a car? And they're like, probably not. But George Huebner did not want to give up on his dream. By the way, Sam Williams, I believe, realized that this is probably not going to go as far as it should go in his mind, and he left and started his own company. So he's at Williams Research, then Williams International. But meanwhile, George Huebner is trying to keep the dream alive at Chrysler. So they toyed with the idea about building a short run, maybe 500 cars. And they did put the 5th generation engine into a car. But the problem, of course, is if you put 500 cars on the road that have warranties on them, you still got to have all your dealerships ready to fix them, warranty parts available. And guess what? Keeping these things on the road for any length of time is probably not going to work out terribly well. So it didn't look very, very good, but George managed to keep Chrysler on the hook, saying, look, let's just keep improving it, keep improving it, keep improving it. So here's a later generation of one. And again, this is not that great looking of a car until you realize it's got a turbine engine under the hood. But somebody realized there was one really cool thing about the turbine engine that nobody talked about in the 60s. And that was, it would run on any liquid that burned. They ran them on tequila. They ran them on Chanel No. 5. They ran them on VO5 hairspray. They ran them on all kinds of stuff. And it runs just fine. The only thing you can't run it on at the time was leaded gas. When you pop the dashboard open, the glove box, it says, do not use unleaded or leaded fuel, because the leaded fuel did something to the blades inside the engine. But now people with the OPEC oil embargo approaching are starting to wonder, wait, maybe that alternative fuel thing might be worthwhile to consider. So here's a photograph of that same car, and it's got a selection of fuels in front of it, including, methanol, coal-derived fuel, broad-cut distillation, ethanol, non-leaded, diesel. You can run them on home heating oil, kerosene, jet fuel. You can run on anything. And, here's the problem. Right before this, gasoline was what, 25 cents a gallon? 30 cents a gallon? So you tell people in 1963, hey, I've got a car that runs on a variety of fuels. People go, so what? That's like saying I've got an alternative to water. It comes out of the wall when I turn a faucet. Why would I need an alternative to that? Well, so you tell people this thing's multi-fuel. So what? And nobody cared, except that, as like I said, the oil issues arose in the 70s, people started realizing, oh, wait a second, there is a possibility here. And so they started experimenting a little bit more with some of these things. And there's a close-up of the smorgasbord there of different things that are running. And that's not even all the things that running much more than that. But the program kept going on, but the program was starting to get smaller and smaller. And the program actually ran until 1988, from 1953 to 1988. And I'll be honest, my brother, before I wrote the book, said, you should write a book about the Chrysler Turbine Car. And I said, a book about a car? And he goes, no, it's a whole program. Started in the 50s and ended in the 80s. I'm like, I didn't know that. And he's like, that's why you should write a book. I'm like, oh, okay. So here we have some guys standing around, and there's some people in here. In fact, I think Mr. Stetcher might be in here as well. But there's a fourth generation turbine in the bronze turbine car. And then that's the last turbine car there, the silver car there. It looks kind of like a La Mirada, but it's actually custom built. And it actually does say Department of Energy on the one headlight hood, because Chrysler also ran into financial trouble. So people say, Steve, what killed the turbine car? And what killed it was the fact that they couldn't make them cheaply enough to where it made sense to make the big leap in technology. But also, Chrysler ran into financial trouble. Chrysler ran into really bad financial trouble a couple times, including once in the 70s. And so when they're facing bankruptcy and somebody goes, hey, can we spend $1 billion on a new plant to make a newfangled engine? People are saying, no, of course not. So the program hung around until 1988, but unfortunately it got to the point where they couldn't convince anybody to make the huge investments necessary to make the full leap over and make them into a mass production car. So this is a photograph, I believe, of all 7 generations of engines. The last generation is the one in the front. And I like to point this out because one of the things that comes into play here is a device called a regenerator. I'm not going to get too technical here, but regenerators play a big part in the story. And the 4th generation engine, which is the middle on the left, and further in the back is the same configuration, there's a big thing on the side that's round. And you'll notice this one's got one on it that's round, and that one's got a round thing on top. That's where the regenerator sits. And the regenerator, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. But that's one of the things that changed from generation to generation was the regenerators. So I wrote my book, and right around the time I wrote my book, it's a complicated story, but I met Jay Leno, and I mentioned to him that I wrote a book about the Chrysler Turbine Car, and it's having a hard time getting it published. And he said, oh, and he read it. He goes, I like car books. Why can't you get this published? I said, publishers don't like car books. And he goes, well, there are car books out there. And I said, yeah, but the people I've approached don't think car guys read. And Jay said, well, I read. And I said, so do I. But what do we do? So Jay, I was sitting in my office, and I'm an attorney. I was sitting in my office one day, and Jay called me, and he goes, can you give me Bill Carey's phone number? And Bill Carey's the guy on the cover of my book who's the one who traveled the country fixing these cars. And I said, why do you need Bill Carey's phone number? And he said, I can't tell you. And I said, Jay, I'm an attorney. You can tell me. And he said, I can't say just yet. I said, it occurs to me that if a person owned a turbine car, they might want to be friends with Bill Carey. And he said, well, we'll talk. So Jay had spoken to the people at Chrysler and talked them into selling him one of their 3 cars. Of the 9 cars that remain in the world, Chrysler kept 3. They're identical to each other. Literally. Same color. The only difference is the VINs. Last 2 digits of the VIN. Now, it's true that Jay's car does have one minor difference. It has a little Hobbs meter that reads engine hours right inside the fender. Nobody would ever notice unless it was pointed out to you. It's the only difference from this car to Jay's car to any of the cars in museums. And Jay got this turbine car. And so I'd given him Bill Carey's phone number, and Bill Carey graciously offered to help Jay get his running and be there when he got it fired up in California. And so in all my conversations with Jay, he said, Steve, if you're ever in California, I'll let you drive it. And so as fast as I could make arrangements to be in California, I got out there and he let me drive it. And he graciously let me write a couple articles about the visit to his garage, including the Chrysler Drive Report, 60,000 RPM on the street, which allowed me to write the whole thing off as a business investment. But got to meet Jay face to face, got to see his collection. He let me drive his turbine car, which is an amazing thing. And he's on the cover of Mopar Action magazine, of course. And so Jay's got a turbine car. And so right around then, my book gets published. The book actually does very, very well. In fact, my agent, I actually have an agent. My agent calls me up once a year and goes, Steve, we just got another royalty check on turbine car. And I go, I know, it's still selling. He's like, it's amazing. I'm like, dude, car guys read. But so Jay has a turbine car. The book comes out. And I thought to myself, that's probably the end of this story. I'll write more books. I'll move on with my life. I'll put some videos on YouTube. Who knows? So I'm doing all this stuff. And one day, Jay calls me on my cell phone. I hadn't talked to him in a while. And he goes, hey, Steve, I got a bit of a problem. What's that? He goes, my engine in my turbine car failed. I'm thinking to myself, okay, I write books about them. I don't fix them. And I go, have you tried calling this person, that person, this person? I'm running down the list. And I realized the reason he's calling me is he's already tried all of these things. And I said, okay, if you're literally at your wit's end, Sam Williams, who was at Chrysler leading this program, started his own company, Williams International, and a lot of the guys from Chrysler went there. So if the people from Chrysler can't help you now, many of the old guys who went to Williams probably can. And he goes, do you know anybody there? I said, yeah, my brother works there. And he said, really? And I'm typing my brother. Jay Leno's about to call you. And Jay calls up my brother. My brother gets to the point you realize it actually is Jay. Rick goes, what do you think is wrong with it? And he said, well, the engine stopped working. I've heard different words used to describe that, but engine stopped working. And we think it's regenerators. Now, I have to get technical on you here, but this is a pretty cool demonstration. This is a great thing. The air comes in the top of that diagram, and there's air compressor. So the cool air is coming in here. It gets compressed, and as it goes around the outside, it goes through a big round thing. It's a regenerator. It looks like a radiator, but it rotates really slowly. 22 RPM. That's slow. Slower than an LP. And it goes through the regenerator, then it goes into the combustion chamber, and then the gases go blasting out over those 2 sets of fan blades. The front set is just what's running the compressor, and the back set runs back to the transmission, puts the power out to the wheels. But the exhaust, before it leaves, goes back through the regenerator, and now as this thing is turning, it's taking the heat out of the air, bringing it to the front, and it's warming up the air that comes in the front end. So it's scavenging heat from the exhaust, so that will lower the exhaust temperature, increase the intake temperature, and increase the efficiency of the engine. That's the theory. But the problem is that the regenerators are kind of fragile. But they never intended these things to be on the road for 60 years. However, my brother said, how bad are the regenerators? And Jay said, well, I can send you a picture. Those are Jay's feet. And that's the good regenerator on its good side. If you flip it over, it's worse. And the other one is even worse. And my brother said, I don't think it's supposed to look like that. And Jay said, I don't think so either. So my brother went to his people at Williams and said, Jay Leno's got this car. He wants us to help him fix it. And they went back and forth a little bit. Williams International right now is doing so much business that they're running at full steam all the time. And they basically said, look, we'll make our facilities available for volunteers who want to work on Jay's car. And my brother said, I'll see if I can get volunteers. He put a message out. I think he got 200 volunteers. People wanted to work on this car. So Jay shipped the engine and the transmission from his car first in a big crate. And Williams let my brother have a whole clean room to work in that was separate from everybody else. And my brother basically got assigned this as his job for a while. And among the other things is there's one of the fan discs. And those blades aren't supposed to look like shark fins. Those are all burned off. And the problem is when you burn metal off like that, it's got to go someplace. And it would then wind up going through the regenerator. So as they took this thing apart, they found all these problems. And now they can remake things like this using modern technology. But also, Jay did have a spare engine. Somewhere along the line, someone contacted him and said, we have an engine. It's complete, but we don't know the story about it. So when my brother put the word out on the street that they were working on fixing his car, he met some of the old timers from Chrysler, and he described this engine. Somebody goes, oh, that's a spares engine. Spares, plural. And my brother goes, well, yeah, it's a spare engine. He goes, no, spares engine. That engine was made out of spare parts. The engine's not spare, the parts were. And apparently at one point in time, they needed to run some tests, but didn't have an engine. Somebody goes, we have all the parts here. I just slapped together an engine. So it didn't have a lot of mileage on it, but also wasn't as well put together, but it had all the parts. So Jay shipped them the spares engine also, and they took it all apart, and then eventually they shipped the car, Pontiac, which is where Williams International is located now. So that's Jay's car. It's a little enclosure there. And Williams is very, very high security. And my understanding is that not a lot of people got to see that, but if you did visit and you're a dignitary or a VIP, they go, oh, by the way, that's Jay Leno's car right there. We just happen to be fixing it. But I got some great photographs because of that. So here's what the engine compartment looks like with no engine. And they wound up taking the engine in and out a few times to get it to work, but they eventually did. But along the way, and they had the car for a few years, they had to do all kinds of stuff. But here, for instance, is the engine housing with everything removed. So you'd have the regenerator covers on the side, you have the intake in the front, the output in the back, but it looks almost like one of those old World War I anti-submarine mines. But they had two of those in there, and then on the shelf behind it is some of the transmission stuff, but they tore both engines down completely and decided to use the best of everything that they could find among the two, or remanufacture what they needed to remanufacture and try to do this as best as they could. So somewhere along the line, somebody said, we're putting it back together again. And believe it or not, there's a real simple little part. It's called a seal. So this, imagine, is the opening with no regenerator on it. You put the regenerator on there, and it rotates slowly. Air is compressing in this way. Exhaust is coming out that way. And this bar is a seal. It is simply a piece of metal about that long. It's got a couple holes drilled in it, and it's covered with something called Chrysler research material. That is not in your chemistry book. It is a proprietary metal. Now, people in aerospace can figure out what it is by testing it. They tested it, they figured out, oh, this is a mixture of this, and this. How's it applied? Turns out it's flame sprayed. And despite the fact they had so many other complicated things in this engine they were working on, that seal became probably the biggest problem they had. They finally got it fixed, but they had to actually find a flame sprayer who could hold this thing in such a way that when they flame sprayed the sides, it wouldn't warp, bend, or do anything. And I think they had to shoot a bunch of them to get it figured out just right. Chrysler obviously had figured this out. And then, sadly, the people who knew this information aren't with us anymore. So while my brother was working on the car at Williams, a bunch of the old-timers did get involved. Bill Carey helped them. Jerry Gross helped them. We'll talk about them in a second. But unfortunately, Dr. Amity Roy, who's the metallurgist behind this and probably would have known this, how to do this in his sleep, passed away a few years ago. And so they didn't have that information handy. So there is what you can do with a 3D printer. If you have access to a very, very expensive 3D printer that you can run for about 120 hours with extremely exotic aerospace metal. And that is a 3D printed regenerator. And they had to print 2 of them. And there's one of the bars that they made, the seal, which they finally got to work. And all of this work they're doing wouldn't have been so difficult except that, like I said, the brain trust that knew all this stuff, a lot of it has passed away. So my brother is a tool designer, and a lot of the stuff he had to literally do from scratch. So to figure out if the bearings and the graphite ball inside the regenerator were going to last in that environment, he recreated it on a bench, and he let that pseudo regenerator there rotate for I don't know how many days and measured the wear on the graphite ball that was inside of it. And it was amazing. But that's among the things they did. So eventually, they put this thing back together again, and they put it on an engine stand, and they bring it outside, and they put all kinds of sending units and thermocouples and all kinds of stuff. And it looks like it's a patient in the ICU. It's got all kinds of cables running off it to a computer on the other side. And there's about 6 people standing around this thing, and they got this thing fired up, and they got it running. And it was quite amazing that they did that, because this is, the engine's going to go back in Jay's car. And seems so long ago that Jay called me and said, hey, my engine blew up. There's my brother on the left with Jerry Gross, the man in the hat. Jerry Gross was a bench engine test guy at Chrysler, and he worked on these engines and later iterations of the engines. And he came out a bunch and helped a bunch. Now, sadly, both he and Bill Carey passed away the last year or so. But my brother filmed the engine starting for the first time on his cell phone. And he texted it to Jerry and said, hey, Jerry, we got it running. And Jerry called my brother up and said, hey, it's making a little ticking noise. It's bothering me. And my brother said, I didn't hear anything. He goes, no. Turn up the volume. So my brother goes into his office, turns the volume all the way, and sure enough, a little slight ticking noise. My brother goes, what's that? And Jerry goes, underneath the engine is a little tiny hole with a little flap on it with a little spring. The spring's gone bad. My brother goes, I didn't even know there's a flap down there. So turns out they replaced the spring, fixed the problem, and that was actually a problem that Jay had complained about when he had the car in his garage, that it dripped fuel out of a spot in the engine that it shouldn't have been dripping fuel out. Turns out the spring was bad. But these guys, the knowledge they have was just absolutely priceless. And so I have to say this. I went to both Jerry Gross's and Bill Carey's funerals, and family, friends, everybody, what great people they were, but also how important the turbine cars were to their life stories. So they got the car running, and they put the engine back in it, and Jay came back out to Michigan to pick it up at Williams International. They now have a very, very large facility in Pontiac. It's the former sound stage that Michigan had for the Michigan film industry. Williams now runs that and occupies that, and there's Jay Leno taking delivery. Now, I will tell you that there was an issue. There was an issue, because when they put the 3D reprinted generators into it, it still ran a little hot. And they know how hot they're supposed to run. And it ran fine with the older generators from the spares engine that were not damaged. So they decided to take the 3D printed ones out, put the spares one back in, give it to Jay that way. And my brother, who was supposed to retire 2 years ago, is now still working on trying to get these things working for Jay, which one of these days he says he can get it done. But Jay right now is driving his car in California, and it's running again, and it's got a bunch of new parts in it, some old parts in it, but we know what went wrong is it over-temped. Now, people are tempted to say it overheated, but people in the aerospace industry will correct you because you don't overheat a jet engine, you overtemp it. Too much temperature is going through. Overheating is what you think of a radiator and coolant and all that stuff. So they know that Jay's engine overtemped, and interestingly, my brother, now working in this aerospace field, goes, modern technology, we can keep that from happening. So they put this little brain box about yay big into Jay's glove box. So if you ever get a chance to see Jay Leno's turbine car, the one difference besides the Hobbs meter is inside his glove box is this little circuit. And what the circuit does, it's attached to two idiot lights underneath the dashboard. On the left, it says engine overtemp, and on the right, it says thermocouple fault. And so when you start the car, it'll check itself to make sure it is correct, and it's running, and the thermocouple fault will not light up. If you overtemp the engine and there's a spot where there is a thermocouple, if it hits 1800 degrees, it will kill the fuel instantly. And if the thermocouple develops a fault where it can't read, it kills the fuel instantly. So it cannot happen again, or at least it shouldn't. So that's the one big thing they did beyond that. So Jay did send us this photograph of himself with a thumbs up. And I should point out the front license plate. In the earlier picture where the car was at Williams, it had a Chrysler license plate on it. And now it says Project Blue Jay, Williams International. And Williams International, of course, is the company, and they blue everything. Everything's blue. Blue Phoenix, Blue Project, Blue this, so Project Blue Jay. So they had the plate made and snuck it on the car, and I don't think Jay minds all that much. They also put a plaque, by the way. They put two plaques right inside on the radiator brace, and it says that a lot of the work was being done in the memory of Sam Williams. Because Greg Williams, the man who was handing the car off to Jay in the front of the building there, is the son of Dr. Sam Williams. And so Sam has passed away, but my brother, who's worked at Williams now for quite some time, met him back in the day, and he was really the visionary behind the project. So besides Jay Leno's turbine car causing all this excitement, there's the Stahl Museum, who got themselves a turbine car. And this story is fascinating because this car was privately owned by a car collector named Kleptz. And I interviewed the man, Frank Kleptz, who owned this car. And when he got it, it was non-running. It was previously owned by Tom Monahan of pizza fame. And while Kleptz had it, he got it running. There's a whole story there with Jay Leno and Bob Lutz and so on. And then when Frank passed away, his son was going to sell it at auction. My understanding is that the auction got short-circuited because the Stahls jumped in and said, we want that car. And these things don't come up for sale very often. There are not that many of them out there, and so on. So interestingly, my understanding of the story is that they got their car, and Bill Carey called the museum and said, I need to be there when you start my car. And Bill Carey came out, and Bill Carey is here imitating the pose in front of my book. And that's a funny story, actually, about that pose. But Bill Carey was the guy, and he knew these cars. I believe he actually had a key for the car when he came over. He had a little box he plugged in that had a bunch of gauges on it, and he knew what they were supposed to all read. And he got the car running and was sitting in the driver's seat looking at all the gauges. And then we took the car out, whichever way we went out, and that way, and drove around the parking lot, and I got to drive the car too. And Bill was having a blast. Bill loved these cars. I think he referred to the cars as his children at one point. Yes. So, I found Bill Carey by doing research, looking through documents. I saw that this name, W. Carey or W.M. Carey, kept popping up over and over again. I thought, well, this is Detroit. I'll look him up in the phone book. He was in the phone book. I called his house. His wife answered the phone and said, hi, is Bill Carey there? And she goes, yeah, who's this? I go, he doesn't know me, but I'm writing a book about the turbine car. She goes, honey, some guy wants to talk about the turbine car. Hey, how can I help you? I'm sitting in his living room the next day, and he's showing me everything he's got. Heck of a nice guy, knew more about these cars and keeping them running and the technical problems they might counter. And it was unbelievable. But the cool thing was that right around this time, the people from Haggerty Foundation, it's the same people who run the insurance company for collector cars, said they wanted to do a documentary about the turbine car. And they also nominated the car to be, I forgot the title they give it, but they put it on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on display. And they also Blue Line scanned it, and they put a bunch of these records in the Smithsonian, and they said the turbine car was a historically significant car that needed to be remembered. And so they shot this documentary. And so I include this photograph because I think this photograph was shot right over there by Terry. And I'm in there 3 times with this car. Had absolute blast. And I'm so glad that they got that shot because we shortly thereafter lost Mark Olson, Jerry Gross, Bill Carey, and, Mark Olson is a guy who runs a website called turbinecar.com, and he was like the patron saint of these cars. He and his family got one of the cars in the 1960s as part of the user program. He got to drive the car to and from school as a 16-year-old. And my brother and I have joked about that. I'm not sure I'd want my peak to be at 16. But how do you come back from that? I used to have a turbine car. Yeah. So the documentary is on YouTube, okay? But interestingly enough, they entered it in a film festival, and we actually won the grand prize down near the Concourse of South Carolina at a film festival. And I got to actually walk the red carpet, which is pretty cool. But it was a lot of fun. But it's a very, very high-quality production. But they released it specifically on YouTube because the Hagerty Foundation is a nonprofit foundation that promotes automotive enthusiasm. So it's a great documentary. But you can go onto YouTube and simply look up turbine car Hagerty, and you'll find it. And it's very, very cool. So that gets us back to here. And I will tell you that my book had come out back in 2010 or 2012. And I thought that was going to be the end of it for my writing on the turbine car. And then after the whole story with Jay Leno happened and the Stahl Museum and the documentary, and, the turbine cars were in the news for a while, I went back to my publisher and I said, look, I really want to put in an update on what happened with all this stuff since my book came out. They said, absolutely. So this expanded edition that says at the top there, it's like 40, 45 pages more that was not in the original edition, plus a bunch more photographs, including a bunch that were not in this presentation. So that's my presentation. I will have books for sale right around the corner here. And I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we're going to fire this thing up.
Oh, we got one right over here.
What was the real reason they came up with? Fuel was cheap. It was innovative. What was the real reason to develop a turbine-powered car?
I think a lot of people looked at the jet engine and said it's got fewer moving parts. It's cooler. Anything that's new is cooler. And remember how everything was space age in the 60s? The Jetsons. So I think that everybody just thought like this is just the next logical step in advancement. Some people get it, some people don't. I think they're really cool, but I also understand why they didn't make them,
I was wondering how much heavier the turbine engine is compared to a regular V8.
How heavy it is?
Maybe it's lighter.
How heavy it is. I'm not sure the exact weight. I don't think it's that much heavier. I'm not sure what the weight is, though. I don't know.
There's a proving ground in Dearborn, and one of the many small signs says Jet Turbine Lab.
Okay.
Would you know anything about what went on there?
Not really, except that Ford, GM, and Chrysler all did turbine technology experimentation or development. Ford built turbine engines for automotive use, and so did GM. And so I'm sure they did. I did not get heavily into that simply because the Chrysler program is what I was focusing on. And Chrysler had the most visible turbine program. But I know that they did do work there at Ford and GM on those cars, so I'm sure it's part of that.
What was the fuel efficiency? I'm sure it would vary with speed, but let's say 60 miles an hour.
That's something that they never released, and I'm sure they tested it, so it probably isn't pretty. I do know that if you were in stop-and-go traffic with this thing, you may as well take the gasoline and pour it on the ground. But if you got it up to 60 miles an hour and held it there like all day long, probably got great mileage. But I've heard 10, 12 miles to a gallon, but it depends largely on your driving habits, I'm sure.
The engine is spinning up to 60,000 RPM.
Yes.
But the input to the transmission's got to be maximum 5 or 6.
Right. It's
What sort of gearbox is on the front of the thing?
there's a 10-to-1 gear reduction. 10-to-1.
Which means torque multiplication too.
Pardon me? Yes. So this engine put out like 450 foot-pounds of torque at 0 RPM. So it's very similar to a motor, an electric motor. They rated it about 130 brake horsepower, which is pretty low horsepower-wise. But the output shaft in the engine ran to a gearbox that dropped to 10-to-1. So 60,000 RPM to 6,000 at the output shaft. And they ran it, by the way, into a torque flight transmission. So for those of you who are wondering, it didn't, first of all, it was an automatic. It was a torque flight. And to make it work, they simply removed the torque converter. And so if you look at where it attaches to the housing on the back, there's no torque converter. But they didn't need one because the way that the gears weren't directly connected, it was air blowing over gears that turned to things. So you could take the slop out of the system that way.
Also on that, going back to the fuel economy, it was equivalent back at that time, equivalent to the standard production 318 engine. Other than during the 50-car program, there was noticeable comments of poor fuel economy. But that was because they'd bring their neighbors over and go, hey, look at this. And it's sitting there idling in the driveway,
Right.
in our parking lot. So it's burning fuel when it's idling.
And funny enough, George Hubner once had a guy from one of the hot rod magazines go, yeah, but those things are slow. And George goes, no, they're not. And the guy goes, come on. And George goes, I'll race you. And George got a turbine car, and he let the other guy pick another car. And before they said go, he puts his foot on the brake and just floors it up to 60,000 RPM. As soon as somebody says go, he pops the brake and launches. And that's how you get rid of the turbo lag. But they didn't want to advertise that because they know that people would be doing that then.
And also with, yes, 135 horsepower approximately, but it was also rated at approximately 425 foot-pounds of torque at the output shaft.
Yeah, at 0 RPM, which is like how motors are. Motors are weird because they measure that it peaks at 0 RPM and it drops off. But it has an unusual power curve, but once you got used to it, it's fine. But, you know, they're just cool.
Okay, we do have a quick question from our Facebook Live post right now. So you guys can download this and check it out too on Facebook Live. John Sanderson wants to know how the 7th generation turbine improved from the 5th.
They were constantly improving the efficiency of them, but I don't have the actual statistics on that. I just know that they were getting slightly better, slightly more horsepower, slightly better fuel economy, and so on. But the one thing I did not mention previously that really played a part at the end of the program was the EPA started cracking down on tailpipe emissions. And you'll remember that in the 60s, nobody cared what came out of the tailpipe of your car. Suddenly in the 70s, they care. And the EPA started issuing standards going, here's what we want and what we'll allow for a tailpipe. And the problem is that the EPA said you've got to do tailpipe emissions with leaded gas because that's what everyone's burning. And Chrysler said, well, what about if we put a car on the road that doesn't use leaded gas? Can we do our emissions with something else? They said, no, you can't do that. And so the last couple generations, they were trying really, really hard to fix the tailpipe emissions. That was the primary thing. It wasn't so much fuel economy or horsepower. It was tailpipe emissions. And there's a couple of things they're trying to bring down that they really couldn't do. But it's almost like they changed the rules on it halfway through the game. Because up until that point, it was like make it dependable and get decent mileage. Now it's like, oh, and make it burn clean too with leaded fuel, which they don't run on. So.
Has anyone run any of the remaining running cars on a modern dyno? And if not, how do we make this happen?
You'd have to talk to Terry because she's got one right here. I'm not aware of anybody who's done that. But like I said before, there are 9 cars left in the world. 5 of them run. Chrysler's got 2. But the question is, dynamometer might actually put a little stress on it. And I don't know if you have that kind of investment in the car, you might not want to stress it too much just to show it off. Well, and here's the thing. I showed video of myself driving your car around the parking lot out here, and I had somebody go, why weren't you doing donuts in it? Because they'd never let me on the property again. That's why.
Okay, did we have any other? We have time for one more question. Anybody? Okay, right here in the back. Cheap seats. Here we go.
What about tailpipe emissions? And I know that that's a variable because there are all those different fuels, but what What's the story on tailpipe emissions?
Well, and that's the problem, is that they were building these things through this generation to be run on a variety of different fuels. And then they're told, oh, by the way, you've got to make it to where your tailpipe emissions would be a certain standard if you were running leaded pump gas. And they couldn't do it. And there was NOx, which is one of the things that they couldn't get those numbers down into an acceptable range. So even those last few cars they had, they worked great for every standard except for the EPA didn't like them. And, we've had that problem ever since.
That is fantastic, Steve. He will be around. He can answer more questions in person after this, but that was awesome. Give Steve a round of applause. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you've gotten to drive both cars. There's only 2 of these turbines that run. There's 5 that run. You've driven 3. So you know this is the best, right? This is the best. This is better than Leno's. That's
Okay? Yeah? Charge it. You want to take it out and drive it?